Sign
She
these
thought she was
papers.
living
It's
her
over.
dream until the truth turned it into a nightmare. Everything seemed perfect.
How can you be
Love,
so
trust,
cruel?
a future carefully built piece by piece. But behind the calm surface, deception was growing, waiting for the right moment to break through. And when it finally does, it shatters everything she believed in.
Congratulations, we've
Yet in
finalized
that
the
moment of
adoption
pain,
papers.
something powerful is born. Because she refuses to stay broken. She rises, stronger, fearless, and ready to take back control of her life. What was meant to destroy her becomes the very thing that makes her unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes life reveals the truth in the most painful ways, but that truth sets you free. Strength isn't about avoiding the fall, it's about how you rise after. And the moment you choose yourself, you take your power back. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to continue creating more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
Julian staged his betrayal on the night of his greatest success. His wife, Clara, nearly 9 months pregnant and glowing in a custom gown, was on his arm at the exclusive opening of his new Manhattan restaurant, Aperture. As the final wave of adoration for his welcome speech subsided, he guided her away from the fawning food critics and toward the quiet of his private office. It was there, with the skyline of New York City glittering outside, that he shattered their world. He told her their marriage had become a stale recipe, predictable, uninspired, and holding back his palate. He explained that his new partner, a notoriously sharp and influential restaurant critic named Simone, was the future he craved. He reminded her with brutal precision that she'd abandoned her own food blog to build his brand, had no legal stake in his new venture, and was now utterly alone. With that, he walked out, rejoining the party to share a celebratory toast with Simone, the perfect image of a new culinary power couple. He left Clara standing there, a discarded ingredient in the masterpiece of his life, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her unborn child, as her reality quietly disintegrated. Julian was sure he'd made a clean cut, leaving Clara too devastated to ever be a threat. But Julian, in his blinding arrogance, had no idea that the quiet, unassuming vintner she called Dad, the man he'd patronizingly called a simple grape farmer, had just signed over his legendary $900 million Napa Valley estate to her. And every last vine now belonged to Clara. This is a saga of ruthless ambition and a betrayal served cold. It's a tale of a man who traded a priceless vintage for a cheap thrill, and the woman who gathered the shards of her broken heart to build an empire that would make his look like a pop-up kitchen. Stick around, because the moment Julian finds out who he truly betrayed is a course you will not want to skip. This story holds a truth we believe is essential for everyone. Your worth is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. The people who leave are not taking anything away from you. They are simply clearing the table for the incredible feast that is your future. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't a confrontation, but a future so brilliant and successful that the person who tried to diminish you becomes a forgotten footnote on your menu. If this message speaks to you, please give this video a like, tell us where you're from in the comments, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another empowering video. Julian was certain his wife would just quietly crumble. He had pictured it for weeks from his tasting kitchen overlooking the park, imagining Clara's dignified, silent collapse, and the only thing he felt was a profound sense of release. No guilt, no second thoughts, and certainly no love. He had observed her earlier that evening, her pregnant form outlined against the city lights, and his only thought was how utterly bored he was with her. He was tired of her steady encouragement, tired of her gentle nature, and tired of her absolute faith in him. Tonight was the climax. He had been preparing the ingredients for months, waiting for the perfect moment to serve his final dish. Most would consider a celebration a cruel time to end a marriage, but Julian saw it as a strategic move. Clara was emotionally invested in his success, surrounded by his supporters on his territory. She would be too shocked to make a scene, too broken to argue. That's what Julian wanted, a swift, clean acquisition of his freedom. No messy emotional fallout, no lengthy negotiations, just a sharp break that would set him loose. A warm hello to everyone tuning in, and welcome. Before we go any further, please support our channel by tapping that like button and subscribing. We would also love to see in the comments where you're joining us from. Are you watching from London, or Sydney, or Mumbai, or Rio? It's always amazing to see our worldwide family. Now, back to the story. The atmosphere in the lavishly decorated restaurant was intoxicating, a mix of expensive champagne and ambition. It was one of those perfect New York nights, crisp and clear, when the city feels like the center of the universe. A hand-picked list of about 200 culinary elites milled around, a blur of designer labels and bespoke suits. The restaurant, Aperture, was Julian's magnum opus, and this was its debutante ball. Clara stood by the immense plate glass windows, a hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. A soft, sudden flutter from inside was a small reminder that she wasn't entirely by herself. The small life she was nurturing felt like a secret promise of a different kind of joy. But in that moment, Clara felt profoundly alone. She felt invisible. Her father, Marcus, had always been her anchor in Julian's chaotic world. When she was just a girl, terrified of failing a class, he'd sit with her for hours teaching her about patience and process. When she was a young woman, devastated after a relationship ended, he told her she was a classic vintage in a world full of cheap table wines. After she married Julian and got swept up in his relentless pursuit of fame, her father had called her every single day, not to ask about reviews or profits, but just to ask about her. Now, with her father on a planned trip through rural France and completely out of touch, Clara felt adrift in the powerful current of Julian's ego. "Are you all right?" her best friend Lena whispered, squeezing her arm. Clara could only manage a faint smile, but she was miles from all right. She hadn't been for months, sensing an ever-widening gulf between her and the man she loved. Her gaze swept the room, searching for Julian. He was supposed to be at her side, presenting a united front. That's what partners did. They shared the victory. But Julian wasn't looking for her. He was tucked into a corner booth, engaged in a hushed, intense conversation with a woman Clara knew on sight, Simone Dubois, the formidable critic whose review could make or break a restaurant. It was more than a professional chat. His entire posture was one of deep intimacy. He was completely focused on Simone, leaning in so closely their heads almost touched. He seemed to have forgotten Clara even existed, as if she were just another patron he needed to impress. Clara murmured his name, Julian, but her voice was lost in the celebratory buzz. She watched him reach out and gently brush a crumb from the corner of Simone's lips, a small, proprietary gesture that made Clara's stomach clench. It was a gesture of familiarity, the kind he once reserved only for her. The head chef was now on the stage. "We are here tonight to celebrate a true visionary, a man whose passion and genius, our founder, Julian Croix, is a force of nature." Clara tried to feel the surge of pride she was supposed to, but her vision swam with hot, unshed tears that she desperately blinked back. Her hands shook as she held her belly, the baby kicking again, a sudden, insistent thump, as if it could feel the icy dread creeping into its mother's heart. "I am so sorry, my love," Clara whispered, the words a silent vow. "I am so sorry." The toast continued. One speaker after another lauded Julian's singular vision and his brilliant partnership with Simone and her publication. A food blogger recounted a story of how Julian once worked for 3 days straight perfecting a single sauce. An early investor tearfully recalled how Julian had promised to make them all rich, and he had kept his word. Through it all, Clara felt a deep, profound chill, and Julian never once glanced her way. After the final applause, the guests began to circulate. They approached her with beaming smiles, saying things like, "You must be bursting with pride, and the two of you are such a power couple." She tried to smile back, but every compliment felt like a paper cut. Then she saw Julian striding toward her, and Simone was walking right beside him. For a heart-stopping second, a wild hope ignited within her. He's bringing the most powerful critic in the city to celebrate with me, but Julian wasn't coming to share his triumph. He stopped a few feet away, his expression one of cool detachment, with Simone at his side like a sleek, dangerous accessory. "Clara, we have to talk. Tonight?" Clara's heart began to pound against her ribs. "Tonight, Julian? It's a party. This is hardly the time." "It's the only time," he countered, his voice quiet but unyielding. "This is about what comes next, and Simone is a part of that." The finality in his tone was terrifying. It wasn't anger, it was the sound of an account being settled. She let him lead her away from the crowd, toward the glass-walled wine cellar that served as the restaurant's centerpiece. Her heels clicked loudly on the polished marble floor. He wasn't taking her to a private room, he was putting her on display. The cellar, meant to showcase his collection, now felt like a cage. Her pulse hammered in her ears. "What's going on, Julian?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're scaring me." He shot a quick look at Simone, who offered him a small, affirming nod. "Clara, this is Isabel." The other woman's smile was a perfect, sharp line, an architect's blueprint for civility. "We decided a direct approach was the most efficient," Marcus said, his voice as smooth and cold as the polished concrete floor. "Our partnership is being deconstructed." The words felt alien in their sleek Chicago loft, sharp-edged and out of place. She couldn't make them fit. "What?" Clara whispered, her hand instinctively going to the small of her back for support. "You heard me," he stated, his gaze level and unpitying. "I'm moving forward. Isabel and I are breaking ground on a new life together." The panoramic view of the city skyline seemed to tilt and blur. Her other hand covered her stomach, a fragile, useless shield for the child she carried. "But why?" she asked, the question tearing from her throat. "Marcus, we're having a baby. We're building a family." "That's the unforeseen complication, isn't it?" he replied, folding his arms. He nodded at Isabel, who stepped forward. "Clara," Isabel began, her tone as calm and measured as a project proposal, "we've assessed the variables. A child is not a sustainable feature in the design we're implementing." The sheer, chilling arrogance of this woman discussing her baby like a zoning variant sucked the air from Clara's lungs. She looked at Marcus, her eyes pleading with him to stop this. "How can you let her?" she cried, hot tears making the city lights fracture into 1,000 pieces. "How can you stand there while she talks about our child like some structural flaw? How could you even imagine something so cruel?" "I imagine a lot of things, Clara," Marcus said, his voice completely flat. "I imagine this marriage was a foundational error. I imagine I've been living in a poorly designed space for years, and I am certain I deserve a structure with more integrity." "Something more," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "More than what, Marcus? More than me? More than our son?" He gestured toward a sleek, dark tablet mounted on the wall of their Gold Coast apartment. "The dissolution agreement is ready for your review," he said, his tone as minimalist as their furniture. "My biometric signature is authenticated. You just need to add yours, and we can consider this project complete." Clara stared at the glowing screen, her hands shaking so much that the reflection of the city in the dark glass shivered. Outside, the lights of Navy Pier twinkled, a view he had once called their shared masterpiece. She thought he was packing for an architectural symposium in Dubai. Instead, her husband, the man who had promised her a lifetime, was demolishing their world with a digital signature while their unborn son shifted inside her. "Marcus, please," she begged, reaching for him, but he stepped back as if her touch would leave a smudge on his perfect facade. "Not like this. Not before your trip. I'm carrying your son. We are supposed to be a family." "You should have thought of that before you stopped evolving," he said, his voice utterly detached. "Before what?" Clara's voice rose from a whisper to a sharp, wounded cry in the cavernous space. "What did I do wrong? Tell me, Marcus, what was my unforgivable design flaw?" "You settled, Clara," he said, his tone laced with a kind of clinical pity. "You're always tired, always so sentimental. You just tinker in that little garden of yours. You lost your ambition. Look at yourself. You've let things get overgrown." "I'm pregnant," she shouted, the last of her composure shattering. "I am 32 weeks pregnant with our child. Of course I'm tired. Of course my body is different. How can you be so monstrous?" "I'm not being monstrous," Marcus countered, meticulously adjusting the cuff of his stark white shirt as if closing a deal. "I'm being honest. I don't love you, Clara. I haven't for some time, and I am done with the pretense." Clara wrapped her arms around her belly, feeling the baby kick, a sudden sharp protest as if he could feel her heart breaking. The room swayed and a wave of dizziness washed over her. She wanted to scream, to throw the tablet against the wall, to shatter the cold, perfect world he was so proud of. "Just sign the document," he said. "Let's not add unnecessary delays to the timeline." "No," Clara replied, her voice shaky but threaded with a new, fragile steel. "I will not sign it. You don't get to just bulldoze my life." "As you wish," Marcus shrugged, utterly unmoved. "I'll have my legal team handle it. But I assure you, Clara, that is a blueprint for failure. You have no leverage, no real income since you scaled back your firm, no significant assets, no portfolio to speak of. That little plot of land your mother left you is a rounding error. You have nothing, and you will be outdesigned at every turn." Each word was a deliberate, crushing blow. The worst part was that he was right. Clara had put her landscape design business on hold at his urging, so she could have a peaceful pregnancy. He promised to manage their future. He told her to focus on nurturing their family. And she had trusted him because she loved him, because she believed in the life they were building. "How could you do this?" she choked out, the words feeling like stones in her throat. "Who are you?" Marcus didn't answer. He checked his watch, the very picture of a man on a tight schedule. "My car is downstairs," he said. "Sign the papers, Clara. The project is terminated." And with that, he picked up his slim portfolio case, turned, and walked away. He strode down the long, gallery-white corridor without looking back, past the abstract sculptures he'd curated and the smart home panels he'd programmed. He stepped into the waiting black car, which pulled away from the curb and vanished into the river of downtown traffic. Clara watched it go before her legs buckled. She slid down the cool, sterile wall to the marble floor, a solitary figure in a vast, empty showroom. She held her belly and sobbed, a deep, silent grief that convulsed her entire body. Her sister Lena was the first person she managed to call. "Clara, my God, what is it? Are you okay? Is the baby coming?" But Clara couldn't speak. Only broken, jagged sounds came out as she clutched her stomach, a raw noise of pain escaping as her beautifully designed life was torn down to the studs. A member of the building's concierge staff must have called Lena back, thinking Clara was in labor. Lena was there in 15 minutes, her expression a mix of terror and rage. She helped Clara stand, leading her out of the cold, perfect apartment. Lena drove her to the old Lincoln Park bungalow she'd inherited from her mother, the one place Marcus had no control over. He'd always hated it, calling it sentimental. Lena got her inside and settled her onto a faded floral sofa. She made her a cup of tea that Clara couldn't taste. She found a thick, hand-knit blanket to wrap around her that Clara couldn't feel. She spoke soft, soothing words that Clara couldn't process. Clara just sat there, staring at the familiar cracked plaster ceiling of her mother's old house, clutching the cold, heavy tablet that contained the demolition order for her world. She couldn't comprehend how one conversation could liquidate a decade of shared history. Her husband was gone. She was 8 months pregnant with no business, no access to their money, and no blueprint for what to do next. In the span of an evening, Clara's entire life had been condemned, or so it seemed. For the next week, Clara drifted through a gray fog. She ate only when Lena sat with her, patiently holding a spoon to her lips. She slept only when her body finally collapsed from the sheer weight of her sorrow. She ignored her phone, which lit up constantly with alerts from Marcus's lawyers, a woman from a major firm whose messages were brief and demanding, asking if she had reviewed the terms of dissolution. She would sit in her mother's sunroom, surrounded by towering stacks of books on botany that still smelled of damp earth and old paper, and stare out at the overgrown garden. The house was utterly quiet. No chime of an elevator, no confident click of expensive shoes on the floor, only the gentle hum of an old refrigerator. The tablet sat on the coffee table, its screen a dark, silent void. Every single moving box stacked in the hallway of their Seattle loft felt like another nail in the coffin of Maya's marriage. Filing for divorce was an admission of failure, the collapse of a future she'd painstakingly designed, the shattering of the family she was days from starting. Her best friend, Jenna, was a daily fixture, arriving with gourmet salads and unwavering support. "You need your strength, Maya," she'd say, placing a hand on Maya's rounding belly. "This little one is counting on you." Maya would force down a few bites to appease her, but hunger was a distant memory. At night, lost in the vastness of their shared bed, she'd whisper to her unborn child. "I am so sorry," she would say, her hands cradling her stomach. "I'm sorry your father was happy to let his potential just wither away, but I swear to you, my love, I will be more than enough. I'll build us a life filled with ambition and success." The baby would shift, a gentle roll that felt like an answer, and Maya would weep until she drifted into a restless sleep. Then, on a drizzly Friday night, a message from Leo blinked on her screen. She nearly swiped it away, too exhausted to engage. But they had to be civil. "One last dinner? To toast the start of your next chapter." A knot formed in her gut at his words, but she simply replied, "Okay." "Who is this?" "My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I am an art historian. I was a contemporary and great admirer of your mother, Catherine Moreau. I was on a research fellowship in Florence and only just received the news of her death. Please accept my most profound condolences for your loss." Maya felt a familiar prickle behind her eyes. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Miss Moreau," he said, his voice urgent. "Forgive my forwardness, but I must ask to see her apartment. I have reason to believe she held on to some early work, pieces that are critical to understanding her development as an artist." Maya was completely lost. Her work? My mother was a graphic designer for a local paper. She sketched, of course, but that was all it was. A beat of silence passed. "Maya," Dr. Finch said, his tone now pleading, "please, it is imperative that I see her studio. This is of far greater importance than you realize." The sheer conviction in his voice and academic certainty that pierced through her grief was impossible to refuse. She gave him the address, agreeing to meet him the next day. This wasn't a gallery owner sniffing for a deal. This was something else. A spark of curiosity ignited within her. Why would a renowned historian be desperate to see the doodles of a woman who lived a modest life and never showed her work to anyone? For the first time in days, she took a long, hot shower. She put on a simple silk maternity blouse, running a brush through her hair without glancing in the mirror. She couldn't bear to see the exhaustion in her own eyes. Dr. Alistair Finch arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. He was a man in his late 60s, dressed in a worn but well-tailored tweed jacket, his gaze both scholarly and unexpectedly kind. He surveyed the small, sunlit living room, his eyes skipping over the packed boxes and landing on the few charcoal sketches Maya had left on the walls. A faint, knowing smile played on his lips. "You must be Maya," he said, his handshake surprisingly strong. "You have your mother's intensity." Maya showed him to the tiny spare room that Catherine had used as a home office, and the old man stopped dead in the doorway, audibly catching his breath. He moved into the room as if it were a sacred space, his fingertips hovering over the edges of sketchbooks and worn portfolios. "I haven't seen any of this in 40 years, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Catherine was fiercely private. After you were born, she walked away from it all." Maya stood behind him, a strange unease tightening her chest. "I'm sorry, doctor," she said. "Walked away from what exactly?" Marcus looked at her, his expression a mask of sympathy. "My dear," he began, his voice a low, confidential murmur, Your father was more than just a programmer. He was ether. In the late 90s and early 2000s, he was a ghost, a legend in the digital underground. His code is rumored to be running in secure systems at Fortune 500 companies and government agencies worldwide. He motioned with his glass toward the glittering city skyline outside their office window. He told the world he'd settled down for a quiet life as a freelance consultant. Nobody knew he was still the most sought-after mind in cybersecurity. Maya just stared at him, his words sounding like a language she didn't speak. It was a plot from a spy movie, not her life. That makes no sense, she stammered. Your father, Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with an unnerving intensity, built a legacy of digital keys and backdoors worth a fortune. It's his masterwork. It is, without a doubt, the most valuable and sensitive collection of private security data in the world. He looked around her spacious corner office, then his eyes locked into hers, burning with a strange, acquisitive fire. Maya, your ex-husband didn't saddle you with his failures. He left you a kingdom. He had operated as a ghost, a phantom coder, building impenetrable security systems for the global elite. His final contract was pending a transfer of nearly 8 figures. Maya's world tilted on its axis. She shook her head in disbelief. No, you're wrong. My husband designed inventory software for small businesses. We live in a modest loft in Seattle. He drives a 10-year-old Subaru. He wears flannel shirts. He was just simple. That, my dear, is because he was the most convincing performer I have ever encountered, his lawyer explained over the secure video call. He loathed that world. His love was for the elegance of the code, the puzzle, and for you. He wanted you to have a real life, far from the paranoia and danger of his clientele. He wanted you to love him for the man he was, not the secrets he held. But why lie to me? Maya cried, the weight of 1,000 deceptions crushing her. Why build our entire life on something that wasn't real? The lawyer's expression softened. He had his reasons, Maya, very good reasons. About a year ago, Leo took this last job. He planned for it to be his final exit, a way to be done forever and focus on the only thing that mattered to him, you and your baby. Maya's hand instinctively went to her belly. Leo had been so excited, already drafting blueprints for a custom-built smart crib. As he negotiated this final contract, the lawyer continued, he structured the entire payment to be deposited into an anonymous trust, established solely in your name. How much? Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. The lawyer shared his screen. It was a bank document. Maya stared at it. At the bottom of a column of routing numbers and legal jargon was a final figure. She read it once, then twice, her mind refusing to process the number of zeros. $15 million. The walls of her office seemed to be closing in. The air turned thick and heavy. Maya gripped the edge of her desk to keep from falling. That's not possible, she gasped. It is 100% possible, the lawyer confirmed. And according to his final directives, every single penny is yours. You are the sole beneficiary, his only heir. Maya felt as though she was drowning, like all the air had been vacuumed from the room. She pressed a hand to her sternum, her lungs burning. Are you all right, Maya? The lawyer asked, a flicker of genuine concern in his professional tone. Should I call someone for you? I'm fine, Maya managed to choke out. Why? Why wouldn't he tell me any of this? The lawyer was silent for a moment. Maya, your husband knew you were preparing to leave him. The lawyer went on. He saw how frustrated you'd become. He noticed how your boss, Marcus, was suddenly always around, constantly calling, always shifting conversations to how a woman of your ambition was being held back. He overheard you on the phone with your sister, telling her you felt like you'd married a man who was afraid to want more. Leo told me himself, and I quote, Marcus doesn't want Maya. He wants ether. He's poisoning her against our simple life so he can get his hands on my mind. A profound, icy coldness seeped into Maya's bones. My husband, he said that. He did. It broke his heart, but he was terrified for you. especially when he found out you were pregnant. He wanted to tell you everything, but he was afraid that if you left, Marcus would find a way to manipulate you, to use you as leverage to force Leo to work for him. He was afraid you'd be tricked into a cage, no matter how gilded. Hot tears finally broke free, streaming down Maya's face. He was protecting me. Yes, the lawyer said gently. He made me swear not to activate the trust until after this payment was secured. He said that if you still chose to leave after that, you would need this money to vanish, to build a safe life for you and your child. He wanted you to make sure I and his baby would be secure for the rest of our lives. The realization didn't just break Maya, it annihilated her. The sobs that escaped were primal, violent things, torn from a part of her soul she didn't know she had. Her husband had seen everything. He had seen Marcus's parasitic ambition for what it was while she had mistaken it for mentorship. And he had spent the last year of his life building her a digital fortress, an empire so vast and untouchable that no one could ever use her or her child again. "Oh, Leo," she wept, the words raw and ragged. "I'm so sorry. I was so blind. I am so sorry I ever let you go." Maya ended the call, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The grief was a physical weight, but beneath it, something else was crystallizing. A cold, sharp-edged fury. A mission. She walked back to her desk. The divorce papers Marcus had so thoughtfully provided were sitting in a neat stack, awaiting her signature. Maya stared at them for a full minute. Then she opened her encrypted laptop, created a new file, and began to type. At the top of the document, she wrote, "Project Ether, Rule Number 1, Play the Part." She thought about her next step. She could destroy Marcus for the vulture he was. She could tell the world how he model. He had manipulated her into thinking her loving husband was a failure, but that would just start a war. And stress was the one thing the baby absolutely did not need. No, Clara had to be strategic. She had to be precise. Rule number 2, the inheritance stays hidden. This was her cornerstone. Her family's lawyer was adamant. If Marcus learned about the trust fund before she was legally free of him, he would fight her to the bitter end. He would attach himself to her, desperate for a piece of her future. The money was her foundation. It was her son's security. It had to remain a secret. Rule number 3, the child is the true north. Every single choice Clara made now would serve one purpose, to keep her baby safe, loved, and completely insulated from his father's cold world. Rule number 4, build a new landscape. Clara couldn't survive in Chicago anymore. Every park, every skyline view was poisoned by the memory of his betrayal. She needed fresh soil, a new place where she could grow a life that was worthy of the child she was about to bring into the world. She read the list again, and a feeling she hadn't had in years washed over her. Power. She was taking back the design. Picking up her phone, she messaged the lawyer. "I've made my decision," Clara wrote. "I'm severing all connections." A brief pause, and then the reply. "What is your plan of action? I'm going to tell him I've reconciled with my husband, that he was right about everything. Then I'm going dark. New phone, everything." "A very solid strategy," the lawyer typed back. Clara could almost hear the quiet approval. "If you disappear, he has no legal path to follow you or to make any claim on your son's life." Amelia's fingers were a blur across the screen as she typed the email. "There's just one more thing," she added. "I need to get out of Chicago, Eleanor. My grandmother, you said she had other places. Is there anywhere I can go? Somewhere completely off the grid?" The reply came back in minutes. "Your grandmother's cherished seaside estate in Maine. Over 100 acres of private coastlines and forest, totally isolated. I can have a car for you first thing in the morning." "Book it," Amelia sent back. The next morning, it was Eleanor herself who drove Amelia away from the city, the steel and glass towers of the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, replaced by the dense green forest of the East Coast. They turned through a pair of weathered stone pillars, the name Sea Cliff elegantly carved into a slate sign, and proceeded down a long, winding drive flanked by majestic, windswept pines. As they crested a small hill, the sight made Amelia gasp. The main house was a marvel of coastal architecture, crafted from gray shingled timber and ocean-worn stone, with a vast veranda that offered a panoramic view of the deep blue, churning Atlantic. A broad flagstone path wound down to a private pier where a small sailboat rocked in the tide. The air, crisp with the scent of salt and pine, was a world away from the city's suffocating smog. "My grandmother owned all of this?" Amelia murmured, her voice catching. "She bought it 20 years ago," Eleanor said gently. "She called it her fortress of solitude. She always said it was for you, a place where her great-grandchildren could explore the tide pools and grow up wild and safe." Amelia touched her hand to the cool glass of the window, her eyes tracing the rugged, rocky coastline. Seeing this breathtaking sanctuary through a haze of tears, she understood that her grandmother had planned a future for her, a legacy for the great-grandchild she would never know. It was a gift she never got to give in person. "I'm staying here," Amelia declared, her voice filled with a sudden, unshakable resolve. "This is where I'm going to have my baby." Eleanor, her grandmother's closest confidant, offered a small, knowing smile. "It has always been waiting for you." Over the next 2 weeks, Amelia poured her energy into awakening the estate. She hired a local team to air out the Grand Lodge and polish its rich, dark wood floors. A moving company carefully delivered the handful of cherished belongings from the small condo she had shared with Julian. She worked with an interior designer to create a nursery that felt like a serene ocean cove, with walls the color of sea glass and a mobile of hand-carved whales and seabirds. A beautiful bassinet made from reclaimed driftwood stood in one corner, while the bookshelves were stocked with nautical adventure stories and soft, plush sea creatures. On Eleanor's strong recommendation, she also retained a premier security consultant. They installed a sophisticated yet unobtrusive camera system that monitored the entire perimeter, and a 2-person security detail was posted at the gatehouse around the clock. "Absolutely no one sets foot on this property unless you personally authorize it," the security chief promised her. "You and your child will be untouchable here." Heeding Eleanor's other piece of advice, Amelia arranged a video call with a therapist. Her name was Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman whose compassionate eyes held a spark of fierce intelligence. "You have survived an emotional shipwreck," Dr. Sharma told her during their first meeting. "The shock of your grandmother's passing, followed immediately by your husband's betrayal during your pregnancy, these are catastrophic events that demand a period of careful recovery." She leaned in, her voice both gentle and firm. "Reaching out for help is not a sign of weakness, Amelia. It is an act of profound strength." Under Dr. Sharma's guidance, Amelia began to navigate the wreckage of her emotions. She learned that the fury she felt toward Julian was not just warranted, but a necessary shield against his deception. She accepted that grief wasn't a straight line, but a turbulent ocean, with calm seas and violent squalls. Above all, she realized she didn't have to be perfect. She just had to be present for herself and her unborn child. With every sunrise over Lake Michigan, Olivia felt a little more whole. She'd take long, quiet walks along the shoreline, the brisk Chicago air a welcome shock to her system. She started cooking again, simple, wholesome meals that made her feel grounded. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was sleeping soundly through the night. She'd talk to the baby constantly, her voice a low hum of hopes and reassurances. "We're going to build such a peaceful life, my little sparrow," she'd whisper, one hand cradling her growing belly as she watched the sailboats glide across the water. "A world of our own, just for us, I swear it." And as the city skyline glittered in the distance, for the first time since her marriage imploded, Olivia felt the solid weight of that promise. Meanwhile, back in their high-rise condo, Ethan was learning that the empire he'd envisioned was built on a foundation of code and hubris. The dream he'd chased was proving to be a hollow and staggeringly expensive venture. The first crack appeared, as it often does, in the numbers. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the latest burn rate report from their accountant. $50,000 in a single month. A wave of nausea and cold anger washed over him. "This is unsustainable," he breathed. Sophia, his partner in business and in life, barely looked up from her laptop where she was reviewing pitch decks. Her dark hair was cut in a severe, powerful bob. "Well, there's the server lease, the consultants we flew in from Silicon Valley, the client dinners at Alinea, my daily car service, and the launch party we threw at the Art Institute. I see the line items, I get it," Ethan cut in. "We have to scale back, immediately." Sophia had zero interest in scaling back. "Ethan, I am done working out of this sterile condo," she declared, closing her laptop with a decisive snap. "We need a proper headquarters. I'm thinking a full floor in the West Loop. It needs fiber, a state-of-the-art security system, a skyline view for investors, and a private chef for the executive team. You did promise me we were going to be a unicorn, didn't you?" "Sophia, a lease like that is millions," Ethan protested, his voice tight. "And," she countered, her tone cutting, "you told me your algorithm was revolutionary. You said you were the next big disruptor. Was that just talk?" "No, not at all," Ethan lied, feeling a drop of sweat slide down his back. The truth was, his highly touted tech startup, once hailed as a game changer, was bleeding cash. The reason was brutally clear. Ethan had checked out. He was ghosting his lead engineers, dodging calls from anxious creditors, and missing key product deadlines. He'd become so obsessed with Sophia and playing the part of a tech mogul that he had abandoned the very innovation that was meant to fund their lifestyle. One after another, the angel investors had lost faith and pulled their funding. Without capital, there was no revenue, and without revenue, there was no way to pay for the first-class flights, the designer suits, the exclusive tech conferences, and the endless stream of gadgets required to keep Sophia impressed. To compound the disaster, the charming Lincoln Park Greystone he'd owned with Olivia, which he'd planned to sell for a quick infusion of cash, was sitting unsold on a cooling real estate market, without so much as a lowball offer. The venture capitalist blamed a volatile market. Ethan was convinced his chief scientist was incompetent. "I just need you to trust the process," he pleaded with Sophia. "Give me one more quarter, and I'll have the preliminary data stabilized." "That's exactly what you said last quarter." Sophia's voice had a sharp, dangerous edge. Their arguments became a nightly ritual, a toxic cycle of accusation and defense. Sophia would lament the capital they were burning through. Ethan would lash out about her lack of faith. She would hint at pulling her firm's funding. He would weave a fresh tapestry of projections and desperate promises. It was a chaotic, accelerating decline. One night, in the middle of a bitter argument, Ethan's phone chimed. It was his attorney, Miss Albright. "Ethan, we've had a response we need to discuss immediately," the lawyer said, her voice all business. "Olivia has replied to our offer." A huge surge of relief flooded Ethan. It was the first piece of good news in what felt like an eternity. "But she has presented her own set of non-negotiable terms," Miss Albright continued. "What kind of terms?" Ethan asked, the relief instantly souring into a familiar dread. "She is filing for full, sole legal and physical custody of the child, and she is petitioning the court for you to permanently and irrevocably terminate all parental rights." "That's impossible," Ethan yelled into his phone. "On the contrary, Ethan, it's entirely possible," his attorney said, his voice as crisp as a legal document. "Let's be honest. You have absolutely no leverage here. If you fight this, we go into discovery, she'll file for support, and given your company's current financial state, that would be completely ruinous for you." Ethan started to argue, but the fight just evaporated from his body. His lawyer was right. He was on the verge of being wiped out. A messy court battle was a luxury he simply could not afford, and if he was being truthful with himself, A child was a complication he didn't want. The threat of a custody fight was just a gambit, a bitter attempt to make Olivia squirm. "Fine," Ethan spat, the single word laced with venom. "I'll sign." "A wise choice," Mr. Davies replied. "The documents will be messengered to you in the morning." Ethan hung up and stared blankly at the glittering Chicago skyline. Sophia had been watching him from across the living room. "So that's your move? You're just going to walk away from your own kid?" she asked. "I don't have an option," he snapped. "But what about the child support?" Sophia pressed. "You could have forced her to take a monthly check." "Olivia's got nothing," Ethan said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Her dad was just some quiet university professor with a house full of old books. He probably left her with a mountain of debt. You can't squeeze blood from a stone." Sophia let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "So you blew up your marriage and torched your career for what, exactly? No wealthy heiress, no family connections, not a cent of outside income. What in God's name was your endgame, Ethan?" "You," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I set my whole world on fire for you." "Because you sold me a vision of the future." Sophia's voice was like ice. "And what do I have now, Ethan? I'm stuck in a leased condo we can't afford with a founder whose reputation is radioactive. To be blunt, backing you is starting to look like the single worst deal I've ever made." Her assessment lingered in the silent, minimalist apartment, colder than the wind whipping off the lake. 2 weeks later, Ethan's signature was dry on the papers that severed his connection to the child he would share with Olivia. The divorce was final. He told himself it was a clean break, a strategic retreat. But late at night, when Sophia was asleep beside him and the city lights cast long shadows on the walls, his thoughts drifted back to Olivia. He couldn't help but wonder where she'd ended up. He wondered how she was handling the pregnancy alone. He wondered, with a sickening lurch in his gut, if he had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. He tried her cell once, then again, then 5 times over the next week. Each time, the call went directly to her calm, recorded message. "Olivia," he said in one voicemail, his voice strained with an unfamiliar emotion. "I know I destroyed everything. I know what I did can't be forgiven. But I'm worried about you. And the baby. Just send me a text. Please. Just so I know you're okay." She never wrote back. There was only silence. It was a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the divorce papers were filed, and Ethan was alone in the quiet, obscenely expensive condo. Sophia was at a tech founder brunch, likely networking for her next opportunity while running up their dwindling credit line. He was aimlessly scrolling through a financial news site on his tablet, his mind numb, when a headline snagged his attention, making his thumb freeze mid-swipe. "Academic secret fortune establishes new Chicago philanthropic powerhouse." Alastair Farrow. That was Olivia's father's name. It had to be a coincidence. This couldn't be her father, the quiet man with dusty tweed jackets. He clicked the link. The article appeared, and Ethan's world began to tilt. The Chicago philanthropic community is abuzz with the posthumous launch of the Farrow Foundation, funded by a staggering estate left by the unassuming scholar Dr. Alastair Farrow. The real surprise, however, is the revelation that Dr. Farrow quietly built a portfolio of early-stage tech investments, creating a fortune estimated to be north of $100 million, all of which will be controlled by his sole, previously unknown heir. A cold dread began to seep into Julian's chest. He forced his eyes back to the page. Sources within the development industry confirm Hayes lived a remarkably private life, managing his empire from an unassuming office in a historic Boston Wharf building, offering no hint of the scale of his holdings. An unassuming office, a private life. Julian's hands began to shake so badly he nearly dropped his phone. According to the estate's longtime counsel, Eleanor Vance, the entire portfolio will now be managed by his sole heir. Julian felt the air leave his body in a rush. That heir has now been confirmed as his daughter, Amelia Hayes, age 29. And then he saw the picture. It was Amelia, but not the woman he knew, not the quiet, gentle data analyst he had so carelessly discarded. This Amelia was radiant. She stood on a windswept bluff, the wild Atlantic behind her, her hand placed protectively on her pregnant belly, which was beautifully defined by a simple linen dress. Her hair was tossed by the sea breeze, her expression was calm, and she wore a soft, confident smile that spoke of a deep and unassailable peace. The page of the High Society Journal seemed to leap out at him. Ilara Vance, newly appointed director of the $3 billion Vance Family Trust, photographed at the Boston Children's Hospital Gala. Julian let the magazine drop from his hands. It landed with a soft thud on the antique coffee table, but the image of Ilara, poised, elegant, and radiating a quiet power he'd never seen, was seared into his brain. "Wait," Julian breathed, the word a strangled whisper. "That's impossible. It can't be." A $3 billion family trust. His ex-wife, the woman he had dismissed as a mild-mannered literature researcher, the woman he'd left for someone with more fire, was the director of a $3 billion trust. He had divorced one of the city's most prominent philanthropists. He had signed away his rights to the unborn child of one of the city's most prominent philanthropists. He had done it all with an arrogant sense of liberation, nearly dancing out of the attorney's office, certain he had escaped a dull future. Julian bolted from the armchair, knocking over a delicate side table with a crash. He barely noticed. His world had narrowed to a single sickening point of heat twisting in his gut. At that moment, the front door swung open and Tessa waltzed in, her arms overflowing with bags from Newberry Street. "Julian, honey, you will not even believe the sale I found at—" Her words died in her throat, her bright smile collapsing as she took in the look on his face. "What in God's name happened? You look like you've just seen a ghost." Julian couldn't speak. He just stood there, his face ashen, his body trembling. Tessa dropped her shopping bags with a thud and rushed toward him. Her eyes fell on the open journal. She read the caption beneath Ilara's picture, and then she devoured the entire article. She saw the photograph of Ilara, looking sophisticated and influential, and then Tessa let out a scream. It was a raw, furious shriek that echoed off the high ceilings of their modern condo. "A $3 billion trust?" she howled. "Ilara is in charge of a $3 billion trust?" The fight that erupted was the ugliest, most venomous conflict of their entire relationship. For the next hour, they tore each other to shreds. Tessa accused him of being the most gullible fool she had ever met. Julian screamed back that she was the one who had insisted he push the divorce through so quickly, desperate to begin their new, exciting life together. Tessa hissed that if she had known about that fortune, she would have advised him to remain married and simply keep her as his mistress. Julian told her she was disgusting. Tessa just let out a harsh, bitter laugh, saying he'd forfeited any claim to morality when he abandoned his pregnant wife. They hurled insults and blame back and forth, but underneath all the rage was one crushing realization. They had gambled everything on their own greed and had just lost a prize beyond their wildest imaginations. Finally, Julian grabbed his wallet and keys from the granite countertop. "And where do you think you're going?" Tessa shouted at his back. "To see Ilara," Julian replied, his voice hoarse. "I'm going to make this right." He drove like a madman, ignoring stoplights and swerving dangerously through Boston's congested streets until he screeched to a halt in front of the stately brick headquarters of the Vance Trust. The heavy oak doors were locked, and a security officer in a perfectly tailored uniform approached him instantly. "I need to speak with Ilara Vance," Julian managed, his words choppy and breathless. "I'm her ex-husband." The head of security at the main desk impassively consulted a screen. "I'm sorry, sir, but you are not on the visitor list, Mr. Croft." Julian's self-control shattered. He began to beg, his voice cracking with desperation, but a second, far more intimidating guard appeared at the first one's side. "Ilara!" Julian yelled toward the grand vaulted ceiling, his voice echoing in the cavernous, silent lobby. "Ilara, I know you're in there. I screwed up. I'm so sorry. I still love you." Ilara, please! His cries were a hollow, pathetic sound that the marble floors seemed to swallow whole. No one appeared. The security chief informed him in a flat tone that if he didn't vacate the property, the Boston police would be summoned. Utterly defeated, Julian stumbled back to his car. For a full 5 minutes, he could only stare up at the building, a testament to his own monumental stupidity, hoping for some acknowledgement he knew would never arrive. What Julian couldn't know was that Ilara was observing the entire pathetic scene on a security monitor in her office 30 floors above. She watched his desperate gestures, heard the tinny, faint echo of his shouts from the monitor's small speaker, and she felt absolutely nothing at all. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even a whisper of pity. There was only a profound and quiet calm. She rested a hand on her swollen stomach, felt the soft flutter of the new life inside her, and clicked the monitor off. 2 days after his public meltdown, Julian was seated across from his lawyer, a desperate, half-baked plan brewing in his mind. "I'm going to challenge the divorce agreement," Julian declared. His lawyer, Mr. Albright, just gazed at him with an expression of utter astonishment. "Julian, you can't possibly fight a settlement that you yourself insisted upon and rushed through just because you've discovered your ex-wife's financial situation. Why can't I? I've changed my mind." "Mr." Albright took off his glasses and began to clean them with a deliberate, almost painful slowness. "Julian, picture this. You stand before a judge and you claim that you want to invalidate your own agreement because you saw in a society magazine that your ex-wife is the new director of a $3 billion trust. Do you have any idea what happens then?" "What?" "The judge will laugh so hard she'll have to call a recess, dismiss your case as the most shameless act of gold-digging she has ever witnessed, and then she will very likely penalize you for wasting the court's time." Julian's face burned with humiliation, but he pushed forward. "What about my child? I signed away my parental rights." "You signed a legally airtight relinquishment of parental rights," Mr. Albright stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "You declared, with no ambiguity, that you wanted absolutely no legal or fatherly ties to that child." "I've had a change of heart," Julian snapped. "The law, Mr. Croft, has no interest in your changes of heart," the lawyer retorted. "You made a pragmatic, calculated choice." A tense, suffocating silence descended upon the office. "I cannot, in good conscience, and I will not represent you on this," Mr. Albright said at last. "What you're proposing is morally repugnant, and any judge in this state will recognize it as such." Julian stormed out. He hired a different attorney, a more slippery character named Rex with a flexible code of ethics who was more than willing to take his case for parental rights. They convened in a Boston courtroom 3 weeks later. Ilara came with her attorney, Miss Davies, and 2 other lawyers from a prestigious firm. She wore a simple but elegant cream-colored maternity dress, her face calm and unreadable. At nearly 8.5 months pregnant, her condition was unmistakable. Julian showed up with Rex, dressed in his finest suit, though it was starting to look a little worn at the cuffs. He tried to project an air of confidence, but a sickening feeling of dread was pooling in his stomach. The judge was a woman in her late 60s, Judge Miller, with piercing eyes, gray hair styled in a tight bun, and an expression that announced she had heard every lie imaginable in her 25 years on the bench. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Emerson said, her gaze sharp as she looked at Marcus's attorney over the rim of her reading glasses. "The motion before me is a request for parental rights to an unborn child. A child for whom your client, Mr. Thorne, voluntarily, and, I quote, with full and sound mind, surrendered all legal claims less than 3 months ago. You have a very steep hill to climb here." Marcus's lawyer stood up, his posture rigid. "Your Honor, my client has had a chance to process the immense pressure he was under, both in his career and his personal life. He now understands he acted hastily. His love for his unborn child is genuine, and he wants nothing more than to be an active, supportive father." Judge Emerson shifted her focus to Marcus. Is that an accurate assessment, Mr. Thorne? Marcus rose, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had practiced this speech. Yes, Your Honor, I made a profound error in judgment. I was navigating an incredibly stressful time and wasn't thinking with any clarity when I signed away my rights. Now I realize that being a father is the most important role I could ever have. The words hung in the air, sounding almost convincing until Isla's lawyer, Miss Davies, rose to her feet. Your Honor, permission to address the court? You may, Miss Davies, the judge replied. Your Honor, Mr. Thorne's statement is a complete fabrication. He is not motivated by a sudden surge of paternal feeling. He is motivated by a calculated, impredatory attempt to gain access to my client's inheritance and controlling interest in the Greenleaf Tech portfolio. That's an outrageous accusation, Marcus yelled. Judge Emerson's gavel hit the block with a sharp crack. Control yourself, Mr. Thorne. You will have a chance to speak. Miss Davies, continue. Miss Davies connected a tablet to the courtroom's main display. Your Honor, we have compiled a digital forensic report that paints a very different picture of Mr. Thorne's true intentions. Judge Emerson watched the screen as Miss Davies began the presentation, her expression hardening with every slide. First, Miss Davies said, we have encrypted communications between Mr. Thorne and his colleague, a Miss Chloe Vance, retrieved from a synced company device. These messages, dated during the week of my client's mother's passing, show them celebrating what they called the windfall. They were finalizing a business proposal on the very night my client was sitting vigil at the hospital. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Second, we have draft contracts and financial projections, also from Mr. Thorne's devices, outlining a plan to launch a competing firm using proprietary technology from Greenleaf Innovations. Third, we have sworn testimony from several senior partners at Greenleaf detailing Mr. Thorne's repeated attempts to gain access to secure research and development files, beginning the day after his mother-in-law's death. The memory slammed into him, a visceral gut punch. The scene played out in his mind, crisp and damning. Him, trapping a shell-shocked Isla in the sterile quiet of the hospital waiting room, just hours after her mother had died. He remembered sliding the legal documents across the table, mixed in with a stack of hospital forms she needed to sign. He remembered the flicker of confusion in her eyes, the way her hand trembled as she took the pen, too consumed by grief to register his betrayal. He remembered walking out of that hospital and getting into a car with Chloe, leaving Isla to face her loss completely alone. The shame was a physical force, hot and suffocating. Then he remembered the document he'd eagerly signed, the notarized statement where he gave up all paternal rights. He had even added a vicious, unnecessary clause questioning Isla's emotional stability due to the stress of her condition, a final twist of the knife. He could imagine a judge's voice as cold and gray as the Seattle sky. Mr. Thorne, the voice would say with chilling calm, did you truly do these things? He glanced at Isla's stoic profile across the courtroom, and the answer was a silent, resounding scream. Marcus's lawyer, Mr. Chen, stood silent, a statue with no defense to offer. I can explain, Marcus stammered, his voice a dry rasp. Can you? Judge Emerson's voice sliced through the tension. Explain to this court why you were plotting to steal intellectual property from your wife's family company while she was grieving her mother. Explain the series of encrypted messages where you and your mistress celebrated her inheritance as your seed money. Explain why you renounced your own child only to file this lawsuit the day after my client assumed control of her family's billion-dollar estate, suddenly framing yourself as a devoted father. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His silence was a confession. Judge Emerson nodded slowly. Mr. Thorne, I have been on this bench for 30 years. I have seen the heights of human compassion and the depths of its depravity. But rarely have I encountered a case where a man's actions so clearly demonstrate that a child's well-being is his absolute last priority. Every move you made, from the corporate espionage to this disgraceful legal maneuver, points to a single ugly motive: greed. Your petition for parental rights is denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am granting a permanent order of protection. You are to have no contact, direct or indirect, with Mrs. Thorne or her child for any reason. Any violation of this order will result in your immediate incarceration. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus choked out, the words tasting like ash. I beg your pardon. I couldn't hear you, Judge Emerson pressed. Yes, Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice cracking under the weight of his public ruin. Mrs. Thorne, the judge said, her tone softening to one of deep respect. This court grants you sole and exclusive legal and physical custody of your child upon their birth. Mr. Thorne will have no rights, no visitation, and no claim of any kind. I wish you and your baby a future filled with the peace, security, and happiness you deserve. Thank you, Your Honor, Isla replied, her voice steady and clear. Marcus stumbled out of the courtroom, his face burning. In the hall, attorneys and clerks pointedly looked away, but their whispers followed him down the corridor. The courtroom doors had been open. Everyone had heard. They all knew exactly who he was. 3 months later, on a crisp Seattle morning when the rain had finally broken and sunlight glinted off Puget Sound, Isla gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The labor was an 18-hour marathon, but Isla found a reserve of strength she never knew she had. When the nurse gently placed her daughter on her chest, Isla looked at the tiny, perfect face and was overwhelmed by a love so powerful it felt like it was rearranging her on a cellular level. "Hello, my sweet girl," she whispered, tears of joy sliding down her temples. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting my whole life for you." The baby opened her deep blue eyes and seemed to look right into her soul. In that instant, the entire past year, the betrayal, the grief, the public humiliation, the fear, it all just vanished. It had no power here, not with this miraculous, beautiful little person in her arms. She was hers, and that was the only truth that mattered anymore. "Have you thought of a name?" the nurse asked softly. Isla didn't have to think. The name had been a quiet certainty for months. "Rowan," she said. "Her name is Rowan, for her grandmother, for strength." Isla stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Her room bloomed with flowers, a stunning arrangement of white orchids from the Greenleaf Board, a cheerful bouquet from her university colleagues, and dozens more from friends and allies. There were cards and balloons and impossibly tiny gifts for the baby. There was nothing at all from Marcus. Not one text, not one call, not a single word. And for that absolute, deafening silence, Isla was profoundly, endlessly grateful. When she brought baby Rowan home to her sleek, modern penthouse overlooking the Sound, everything was perfectly in its place. The nursery was a sanctuary of minimalist calm with a crib made of sustainable bamboo, soft organic cotton bedding, and a silver mobile of geometric leaves that turned slowly in the light. Books about ecology and science filled the shelves. A comfortable glider was positioned by the floor-to-ceiling windows, giving Isla a perfect view of the Olympic Mountains as she fed her daughter. That first night home, Isla sat in that chair, Rowan sleeping peacefully against her chest as the city lights began to sparkle below. "You will never know what that felt like," Isla whispered to the sleeping infant. "You will never feel the shock of betrayal or the emptiness of being abandoned. You will be raised with honesty and love. You will be valued. You will always be safe." She kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Your grandmother built a legacy of innovation to make the world better," she murmured. "She wanted you to have a foundation to build your own dreams on. And I will protect that legacy. I'm going to do something incredible with it. I am going to make her so proud of us." The baby made a soft noise in his sleep, his little fist gripping a fold of her silk blouse, and Ilara managed a smile as a single, determined tear traced a path down her cheek. In the years that came after, Ilara dedicated herself to forging a meaningful legacy. she established the Beatrice Vance Foundation, an organization committed to funding female-led design and engineering firms with a particular mission to aid single mothers who were starting over after leaving destructive relationships. Ilara knew the searing pain of learning about Julian's betrayal, the profound sense of isolation and disorientation that had followed. She was determined that no other woman should endure that same level of despair. She wanted every woman who had to rebuild her life to understand that she was not alone, that help was there, and that this devastating chapter was not how her story had to end. The foundation became an engine of change. In just 5 years, it had helped get more than 1,000 new companies off the ground across 4 different states. Ilara made a point to attend their events, where she would sit and talk with the women, hearing their stories of struggle and celebrating their victories. At a fundraising gala one night, a young woman named Sarah came up to her. Sarah was 25, holding a sleeping child in her arms, and her eyes burned with an intense resolve. "Mrs. Vance," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I just had to find you and say thank you. After my husband left me, I was completely broken. I had no job skills, no savings. I truly believed my life was finished. And then someone told me about your foundation. Support, I have a foundation. I'm finishing my urban planning degree, and my son is thriving in the best Montessori in the city. You built this new life from the ashes," Amelia said, squeezing her hand. "That was all you, Catherine. I just gave you the blueprints. You're the one who rebuilt the entire structure, stronger than before." Catherine didn't just rebuild, she revolutionized. Taking over her father's struggling development firm, she channeled her energy into sustainable urban renewal and historic revitalization, fulfilling a family dream. Some of her initial projects struggled, but her successes were groundbreaking. Her net worth skyrocketed. She started giving keynote speeches, not about surviving infidelity, but about building modern communities with historical integrity. She became a leading voice in ethical development and women in business. She never uttered Julian's name, but the Chicago business world knew exactly who had lit the fire under her ambition. "True power," Catherine said in a now famous profile in a national business journal, "isn't about getting revenge. It's about building something so impressive that the noise of the past becomes completely irrelevant." She was lauded. Industry magazines featured her on their covers. She won numerous awards for her foundation's work in creating affordable green housing in neglected city neighborhoods. Ivy League universities invited her to be a guest lecturer. She became an icon of resilience and vision. And through it all, little Owen grew up bright, happy, and utterly adored. On his first birthday, he took his first unsteady steps across the wide plank oak floors of their massive Seacliff living room, and Amelia's joyful cheers echoed through the house. He was a gorgeous child with his mother's calm eyes and a constant, curious smile. Amelia made sure Owen knew about his great-grandfather. Every evening, she told him stories of how Grandpa Hayes was a brilliant builder, a man who saw potential where others saw ruin, and how he would have treasured his great-grandson more than anything. "Your great-grandfather built things that last, my love," Amelia would whisper to Owen, "and you have his visionary spirit. That's a legacy to be incredibly proud of." Julian's life took the opposite trajectory. The moment the divorce was finalized, his carefully crafted world imploded. First, Sophie was gone. She sent him a curt one-line text one afternoon saying his personal drama had become a liability and she couldn't risk her career. She wished him the best. For 3 straight days, Julian's calls went straight to her voicemail. He was relentless, a man possessed. By the 4th day, the calls wouldn't even connect. Kenzie had blocked his number. The ambitious young singer he'd gambled everything on had cut him out of her life like a bad demo track. His job as a top A&R executive at Apex Records was the next thing to go. The label heads, who had tolerated his arrogance for years because he delivered hits, finally used the morals clause in his contract to sever ties. The story had gone viral in Austin's incestuous music and social scenes. The tale of the Golden Boy producer caught on stage during his pregnant wife's restaurant launch, presenting his new musical muse with a vintage guitar, one his wife had spent a year sourcing for their anniversary, was a scandal too rich to be forgotten. Nobody in the industry would touch Julian Croft. Security guards walked him out of his glass-walled office overlooking Lady Bird Lake. He sold his classic convertible to pay the first wave of legal bills. He fled his downtown loft for a cheap, sterile apartment in a sprawling complex up north, a place with popcorn ceilings, a rattling air conditioner, and the faint, persistent smell of old takeout. Julian's days were a blur of unanswered emails. His nights were spent staring at the ceiling, sleep an impossible luxury. He was a pariah. His name was toxic. Any recruiter who searched him found a swamp of blog posts, social media takedowns, and scathing articles detailing his public humiliation. He was an industry ghost. Sometimes, in the dead of night, with the sound of a neighbor's bass bleeding through the drywall, Julian would scroll through photos on his phone. There was one from his wedding day, Sophia looking at him with a kind of radiant trust that now felt like a punch to the gut. There was another from the day she told him she was pregnant, her face absolutely luminous as she held up 2 positive pregnancy tests, her eyes wet with happy tears. He had been given everything, a world of flavor, of passion, of genuine partnership, and he had systematically, deliberately burned it to the ground for a cheap thrill. One sweltering afternoon, Julian was walking down South Congress on his way to a pity interview he knew would lead nowhere, when he saw it. The cover of Texas Monthly on a newsstand. It was a photo of Sophia holding their baby boy, Leo, who was laughing. She looked breathtaking, poised, powerful, and completely whole. The baby's tiny hand was resting on her cheek as she smiled into the camera. The headline blazed across the image, "The Reyes Legacy: How Sophia Reyes is Redefining Texas Cuisine." Julian Croft stood frozen on the crowded sidewalk, the sounds of street musicians and tourist chatter fading into a dull hum. He stared at the vibrant image of the woman he had thrown away and the son he was forbidden to see, a bitter acid climbing up his throat. He couldn't escape her. Sophia was Austin's new darling, her face smiling from magazines and morning shows where she discussed her commitment to local farms, her daring new restaurant concepts, and her mentorship programs for young female chefs. Every new success was another turn of the screw. Sophia Reyes wins a James Beard Award. Mesa named Restaurant of the Year. The Reyes Foundation funds a new community garden. The headlines were a constant barrage, each picture a fresh brand of torment. A cold, brutal realization finally smashed through the walls of his ego. Sophia had never been just a talented cook. She had been a visionary. She wasn't just supportive, she was a force of nature. She was never just a part of his world. She had been the entire damn foundation, and in his colossal arrogance, he had taken a sledgehammer to it. The demolition was absolute. The divorce was final, his parental rights terminated after he signed the papers, a permanent inky black stain on his existence. There were no second chances, no rewrites, no way back. Julian Croft, the man who made stars, was left with nothing but the smoldering ruins of his own life. It was a warm summer evening, almost a year after Leo's birth. The wide stone patio of her hill country home was bathed in the apricot glow of twilight, the light spilling across the rolling landscape. Sophia sat in a deep armchair, watching her son crawl on a woven blanket. Leo was on a mission, a determined little explorer, making his way from a potted succulent toward a string of glowing patio lights. A happy, babbling sound escaped his lips. Her sister, Isabella, sat across from her, sipping a margarita. "He has Abuelo's stubborn brow," Isabella noted with a laugh. Sophia's smile widened. "I know. Sometimes when he's intensely focused on a new food," the memory of Julian surfaced, sharp and unwelcome, catching in her throat. They sat in a peaceful quiet, watching Leo finally reach the glowing lights, with a squeal of triumph. "Your grandmother would be so insanely proud of you," Isabella said softly, "not just for saving the family name or for all the awards, but for your composure, the grace you had when you had every right to just scorch the earth." Sophia gently rocked a small woven bassinet with her foot. "Do you know the moment I keep seeing?" she asked, her voice low. "I always go back to the opening night at Mesa, standing in my own kitchen, smelling the wood smoke from the grill, and hearing the crowd gasp when he brought her on that stage with that guitar. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I was so sure my life was finished. I thought I had lost absolutely everything, that I was completely and irrevocably alone." Isabella reached over, her hand covering Sophia's. "But I was wrong," Sophia continued. "I wasn't alone. Abuela was still with me. She had spent her whole life building a legacy for me, a foundation I never truly saw until that night. And the baby." Her face softened as she looked at Leo, who was now trying to eat a lime wedge. "The baby was right here with me, this tiny little secret, a little flutter that reminded me I had a reason to fight." Sophia paused, her eyes tracing the flight of a firefly in the deepening twilight. "I used to think Julian broke me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But he didn't. He just left a massive vacancy in my life, and that was the best thing he could have ever done for me. Not the settlement, not the restaurant, not any of it. The gift was his departure. It gave me the space to finally become the woman I was always supposed to be, without his voice in my ear telling me my ambitions were unrealistic." Isabella wiped at her eyes. "Since when are you so wise?" Sophia let out a rich, throaty laugh. "A therapist who charges $500 an hour," she answered. "Many, many hours of therapy." Their shared laughter floated out on the warm air, mingling with the sound of crickets. Leo looked up at the sound of his mother's voice and broke into a huge, gummy smile, kicking his little legs with joy. "Mama," he babbled, a perfect, happy sound. "Mama, Mama." Sophia rose and lifted him into her arms, pressing her face into the warm curve of his neck that smelled of sweet corn and baby soap. "Hello, my little chef," she whispered. "Did you have fun creating new recipes?" "Recipes," Leo echoed seriously, patting her cheek with a soft hand. "That's right," Sophia said. "Much better ones. You are so clever, Leo, just like your great-grandmother." She carried him inside, where the last light of the day cast long, beautiful shadows through the rooms. The house felt lived in, warm, filled with the evidence of a life being mindfully rebuilt. The main hallway was a tribute. There was no photo of a smiling bride and groom. Instead, there was something far more powerful. A large, framed photograph of her grandmother, Elena Reyes, looking young and fierce in the bustling kitchen of her first restaurant, a wooden spoon held like a scepter. Sophia paused in front of the picture, a nightly ritual. "Say good night to Abuela Elena," she prompted her son. "Nini," Leo murmured, waving a chubby fist at the image. Sophia smiled and walked up the tiled staircase to the nursery. She changed him into his pajamas, the ones patterned with tiny red chili peppers, and settled into the rocking chair to read him a story. "Once upon a time," Sophia began, "there was a tiny little seed that dreamed of becoming a great big tree." Leo burrowed into her shoulder, his breathing already deepening into a peaceful rhythm. He was fast asleep before she had even turned the first page. She closed her eyes, rocking slowly in the quiet room, feeling the steady, gentle weight of her son's heart beating against hers. "I need you to know this," she whispered into the darkness. "Your great-grandmother loved you long before you were here. She spent her life cultivating things that would last, to make sure you would always have strong roots, always have a place at the table. Everything we have, all of this, is because she never let a single person tell her what she couldn't create." She kissed his soft hair. "And your father," she continued, her voice even softer, "your father made choices that will be very hard for you to understand one day. Maybe when you're much older, we can try to figure them out together. But this is the truth you must always remember, Rowan. she whispered. Your value is never determined by someone else's failure to appreciate it. Your worth is not a blueprint that can be torn up by a careless hand. You are a masterpiece. You are cherished. You are more than enough. You always have been. Ilara settled Rowan into his crib, drawing the soft cotton quilt over his tiny body. The mobile, a collection of delicate wrought iron stars, spun slowly above, painting shifting patterns on the wall. Ilara lingered in the doorway, mesmerized by the quiet rise and fall of his chest, his small fists curled near his chin. Innocent, whole, safe. This was Ilara's world now. It wasn't the glamorous fantasy of being the muse to a celebrated chef, building a culinary empire. This was better. This was real. This was the story of a woman who was restoring her own life, using her mentor's lessons as her guide, discovering a structural integrity she never knew she possessed. She was building something magnificent from the wreckage of a deception. Ilara dimmed the nursery lights and walked down the heart pine hallway to her bedroom. She paused by the arched French doors, looking out onto the moon-drenched courtyard. The fountain trickled softly, and a colossal, ancient magnolia tree stood guard. Somewhere across town, in the cold, stainless steel gleam of his award-winning restaurant, Julian was likely staring into a fire, tormented by the warmth he had so thoughtlessly extinguished. But Ilara knew she hadn't truly thought about Julian in months. He was now what her old professor would have called a flawed design, a crack in the foundation that was discovered before the walls went up. There was no point in revisiting the old blueprints. She understood her own strength and was already drafting the future. Ilara slid between the cool, crisp sheets of her bed, pulling the duvet to her chin. On her nightstand, a tablet glowed, displaying the initial designs for Hearthstone Restorations, her new independent firm. Beside it was a framed sonogram, a perfect little silhouette against the darkness. It was the most important design in the room, the keystone of everything she would build. "Thank you, Professor," Ilara whispered to the memory of her mentor. "Thank you for teaching me that the strongest structures are the ones that have been tested. I hope I'm making you proud." She placed the tablet on its charger, turned off the lamp, and closed her eyes. Outside, the city breathed its humid, rhythmic life, and in the distance, a lone saxophone played a soulful, lingering melody that eventually faded into the night. Ilara Benoit slept peacefully, and her newborn son slept peacefully in the next room. They were safe. They were loved. They were, finally, home. And that, you see, is where their real story starts. Always remember, your soul is not a signature dish that loses its flavor just because one critic with a bitter palate gave it a bad review. Your value is not a historic home to be gutted by a developer who never understood the beauty of its architecture. Sometimes the person who walks away from you is just clearing the site for the monument you are about to build. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have because it gives you the freedom to create your legacy while nobody is watching. And sometimes the most satisfying victory has nothing to do with revenge at all. It is about designing a life so magnificent, so genuinely joyful, so structurally sound, that the person who tried to shatter it becomes nothing more than a footnote on a discarded blueprint. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please press the like button and subscribe for more. Pass this story on to anyone who's ever had to draw up new plans for their life. Let us know in the comments how you would have reacted to Julian's betrayal. We are eager to hear your thoughts. Until the next story is unveiled, hold your head high and remember that you have the power to design your world, even from the ruins. This narrative was meticulously constructed by our writers to explore the harsh realities of betrayal and the strength it takes to rebuild. Thank you for being a part of this emotional journey with us.